I'm here in the beautiful assembly rooms with the amazing Oliver Burkeman ahead of his show here tonight, recording a podcast on what it means to live a meaningful and productive life. Trust me, you'll unlearn everything that you have learned about modern productivity through the guise of this expert. I'm a huge fan of him and his book, and it's been an absolute delight to interview him today. Oliver Burkeman, welcome to Origin Story, here live in the assembly rooms in Edinburgh where your show is tonight. Thanks for coming through.
Thank you very much for having me on.
I've been reading your most recent piece of work, Meditations for Mortals, and I've described it to my friends as like I've went through this productivity puberty almost.
All right.
And what I mean by that is that I went through some changes, there was symptoms, there was a kind of arduous process of weeks reading your book where I've came out of that grown up and have seen productivity through a mature lens.
Oh, it's a lovely way to put it.
And it's such a funny way to describe it, but I went from boy to man almost reading that book.
I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad. I was specifically glad if you felt like the experience of reading it affected the change in some way, because that was what I really wanted to do. I didn't want to do one of these books where it's like, here are the 20 things to put my system into practice, and then you never get around to putting it into practice, right? Because you're too busy or whatever. It's like, can you actually go through some of that change by reading the book?
And one of the kind of things that unearthed in me was the understanding that us type A productive people are actually the most out of control, insecure type of people. And that was a really difficult pill to swallow. But your writing helped sweeten the pill, for the lack of a better term. It really did.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, I think I have been told in the past that people use the word confronting to describe the stuff I write, and I'd never really come across that use of the word until people started saying they found my books confronting. But I think that, yeah, there is something, isn't there, about like the discomfort of facing certain truths, both about like reality in the world, and then about like, yeah, the personalities of those of us who are into this stuff, that is kind of unpleasant, but it's a good kind of unpleasant in the long run, right? It's like you end up more resilient or calm or something as a result of having gone through that.
When people ask you, what do you do and what do you write about, how do you bring that to life?
I mean, I say I'm a writer and an author and a journalist usually, because the journalism side of this is still really important to me, even though I'm not like working on a daily newspaper anymore. And what I write about, I don't know. Productivity, philosophy, mortality, I don't know. Then I sort of get on with a long list of things. I guess what it is human limitation, right? The ways in which we're limited as humans, the sort of non-negotiable ways in which we're finite, and how kind of stepping into that instead of trying to avoid feeling the truth of it is actually a real portal to, doing more, feeling better, living a more fulfilling life. It's not something to sort of run away from in horror.
Is that interlaced or intersected with your own life? You were a journalist with The Guardian. Was there a moment in your own origin story that you were confronted with the truths that you've gone on to write about?
I mean, there were many moments, and I sort of write about this a little bit in the introduction to this book. Looking back now, me in my sort of mid-20s working at The Guardian, in this context where I was like, I was at the place I sort of dreamed of working at one day in my life, but quite early on in my career, in this very sort of deadline-driven environment. It's even more high pressure in certain ways now because the internet was only really getting started. But this idea, like you're constantly working towards a deadline at the end of the day, and then maybe you get a day or two's more relaxed, but then there's another one and then another one. And for anyone who wants to try to like feel in control of their working lives, which is a big part of what's going on, I think, with that kind of productivity obsession. It's really useful, but it's also really terrible, right? Because I was constantly telling myself, right, okay, right now I'm behind and I should be going faster and I should be more productive and more organized, but just as soon as I've got this deadline out of the way, then I'll like take a breath and I'll like sort things out and I'll start eating better and spending more time with my friends and not just like existing on pizza and Coke and trying to get through to the next deadline. But then, of course, there's always another deadline and another deadline. So you end up kind of living in this state of mind that says, like, soon in the future, I'm going to finally like figure out how to do this and be in charge of it, but I'm never quite there. And I think that yearning to feel like you know what the heck you're doing and that you're in control of it is what powers a lot of interest in productivity systems, apps, gurus, all the rest of it.
Does busyness create busier?
Yeah, I mean, in general, right? Like being very overwhelmed with stuff prompts you to try to deal with it in ways that leave you feeling more overwhelmed. The example I give in the previous book I wrote, 4,000 Weeks, is like email is a classic example of this that most people can relate to. If you have a sort of completely overloaded inbox and you say to yourself like, okay, I'm going to get on top of this now. This has gone on long enough. I've got to sort of handle this. And then you start answering email at a much more rapid pace than you did before, staying on top of it. You just get more email, right? Because you reply to more people quickly and they reply to you, and you get a reputation for being responsive on email, so more people email you in your organization or whatever. And so there's this pattern that repeats. I called it the efficiency trap in 4,000 Weeks, right? This pattern that repeats through all sorts of domains where if all you do is try to make any system more efficient, including like yourself, because you're feeling like you've got too much you want to do, the main result, all else being equal, is that like more and more inputs will be attracted into that system. So you won't end up any less busy or stressed than before.
One symptom that I've came across and have confronted in my own journey after reading your books is a term I'd call productivity dysmorphia. For a while I'm in the room with a bunch of young fellow entrepreneurs and freelancers, and we consume a lot of this kind of type A content online, like sleep doesn't matter, work until your eyes bleed, that kind of stuff. But in fact, your book has, for me, uncoiled a lot of those beliefs. And in fact, you can be more productive, hand over more quality work by doing less and not berating yourself on the way. And do you think social media has a responsibility to play, or the types of content creators on social media has a responsibility to play in this kind of productivity dysmorphia that we face?
I mean, yes and no, right? And the no part is that I was totally in this situation long before much social media existed. I mean, I'm of an age, Generation X, such that computer technology and to some extent the internet was in the water when I was a sort of teenager. But social media is a development of some time after that, and I was already deep in that kind of feeling of needing to do more to feel all right about myself. So talk about that if you like. But I definitely think it's a sort of an exacerbator and a catalyst because, apart from anything else, it's a very appealing. When you're stuck in that space, you want more advice that implies like it might be the silver bullet to get, the one thing that if you started doing, you'd finally get to that plateau of being in control. Or if it feels more like what you need is kind of gumption and mindset, then you need to keep consuming those messages to keep you lifted up and sort of high on that stuff. So I definitely think it's a bit like, we talk about how social media spreads a lot of anxiety about political topics or about an anger about political topics or about like whether AI is going to lead to the end of the world, or all these kind of apocalyptic visions that are all to do with like anxiety is kind of contagious. And I think anxiety about productivity is contagious too. And like the message that, if you just emulated somebody in a slightly more disciplined way, or you got up another half hour earlier, or in some other way you sort of like squelched your desire to like rest and relax and sleep or whatever, then you'd finally get there. I think that's a very, very seductive message.
I saw an internet meme, I think it must have been yesterday, and it was like, me resting, also me resting, trying to find a more productive way to rest.
Right, yeah.
And it's so true, like I berate myself quite a lot from doing that. What was the history, or maybe even the evolutionary biology of us attaching quantity of output to quality of character? I can't imagine that it's the same across every culture and society. I can't imagine that other mammals feel the same way. Why do we, maybe in the UK and maybe the West, have that correlation or that relationship?
I mean, I think there are so many different reasons that it's almost not worth trying to identify like specifically one of them. I'm sure that it's a sort of combination of evolutionary reasons and like capitalism, and there's lots of religious influences in there as well. The Protestant work ethic, right, is one of the classic ways of understanding this notion that through the amount of work that you do, you demonstrate that you're like saved in a religious sense. But there's something of that even for those of us who are like sort of completely secular. There is that sense of like there's something of like salvation related in this idea. There's this idea that if you could only get enough done and be a kind of person who was sufficiently optimized to do all the things that life threw at you and all the things you wanted to do, like then you would reach this level of adequacy. And obviously, you know, like consumer capitalism has a great interest in keeping us feeling like we're not quite there yet, because then you keep working and you keep buying and spending, all the rest of it. Maybe even evolution. I'm a little bit usually suspicious of evolutionary arguments, but like, yeah, evolution doesn't have a strong interest in your being happy, right? It has a strong interest in your being just dissatisfied enough to keep doing all the things it wants you to be doing. I think what it adds up to for a lot of us is that feeling that I think you were referring to earlier, right? That it's not like you'd like to achieve a whole bunch of stuff because that would be fantastic and your life could be even better than it is now and you could help lots of people and it would be satisfying. It's like you have to do all this stuff because then maybe you'd get up to the baseline level of like, okay, I'm going to be financially okay and I can feel good about myself and la la la. So it's like all this struggle just to be like just about all right. And I think you see that in a lot of people who are like famously very wealthy and successful and powerful, right? They're doing it fueled by some kind of pretty deep insecurity.
Is this something that's confronted your character in your own life? We spoke before we started recording that you went to a comprehensive school and then found yourself in Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
And I often think about how people act in accordance to their reward systems, whether that's in an organizational environment, that their bosses' commands, or a place like Cambridge that is affluent with high achievers. Mm-hmm. Were you confronted with that in your own journey, specifically in Cambridge?
I think something significant happened to me around that college time, right? Because I wasn't a super anxious kid at school, and I was a ball of anxiety at university. And I mean, I don't want to make it sound like I came from a very, very gritty working class comprehensive school. It was a pretty like comfortable kind of comprehensive school, but still, you know, you find it sort of relatively easy to be. I found it relatively easy to be like do very well compared to the average, like in that school, and I was probably had, you know, one of the more privileged lives of people in that school. And then suddenly you're in this domain where like everybody's only there because they were the top of their class in the whole country, and a whole lot of them come with this kind of like infused into their blood confidence that you get from another layer again of the class system. So yeah, like at that point, I became sort of very stressed out that I didn't have what it took to do well enough. And also, and this I get from goodness knows where, I mean, I can speculate, but like also this sense that was like life or death, right? Because that's one of the things that I think goes along with this mindset is not just that you really, really, really want to like do more and drive yourself harder, but that if you didn't, that would be like a total calamity. And partly, you know, the economic system that we live in reinforces that, right? It is really bad if you can't get the qualifications you need and find the job opportunity you need. Things are not, you know, things are not good for people who have the misfortune to not be able to do that. But at the same time, you know, like it would have been okay if I hadn't got like the best possible grade in the best possible class or degree or whatever. And I don't think I was aware of that at all during my college days. I think I was basically like, I've just got to excel in this, otherwise like it's all over. It's very strange because I don't think I got that message, at least overtly, from my parents. I think that but I got to Cambridge and was, felt I had to do anything I possibly could to try to like keep my head above water.
To make this practical to the listener, and frankly, I'm asking for myself, if anything, if there are people listening to this who work in an organization that praises achievement and productivity, and sometimes the metrics of success within those organizations are utilization, for example, that's me talking from a consulting background, how does one take what they've learned from your book, which in the grand scheme of things, I feel encourages a slower pace of life, or at least a slower pace of mind. But then these reward systems on the fringe of their everyday life that keep sustenance in their life, it pays them bills. How does one marry the environments in which they have to go to work in and this newfound learning from your books that, in my opinion, creates a slower pace of life?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And although I don't work inside one of those environments, we all work inside this culture, which has a lot of the same messages. I think a big part of the point is to really sort of emphasize this thing which you've already touched on, that like this, although I think this does point to a sort of slower and gentler and calmer pace of life, I also think it leads to more accomplishment on the things that matter, right? So I do think that whatever autonomy you have in a corporate context to sort of say, let me go off and do my thing, like the results are going to speak for themselves to some extent. There is that awkward conversation depending on the context where you have to say like, can we experiment with this? Cal Newport, I'm sure you're familiar with his work, has done like a lot of interesting work on this specific question of like persuading senior management to experiment to see if it isn't in their own best interests to let these things happen, because I really think that they ultimately are. The sort of productivity at all costs approach not only leaves people burned out and unsatisfied and wanting to look for another job, but there are reasons why it sort of systematically prioritizes the wrong work and systematically causes people to focus on the things that they can either, get the quickest burst of dopamine for having finished, or the quickest proof of life in the surveillance systems of the company to show that they're doing things. But that is going to almost always mean not the things that move the needle the most, right? For the organization as much as for the individual. The other side of it, I guess, is just that like it's like an internal. Sorry, I'm tapping the microphone. The other side of it is it's like an internal psychological process ultimately, right? You go to your desk and you have to make choices as a finite human with a vastly greater range of things you could do with the next hour than you're going to be able to do with the next hour, because you can only be in one place at one time. And to some extent, even if the culture around you demands that you do 20 things with that time, like pretending that you're ever going to meet that request isn't going to help anybody. And so there's actually a sort of inner discipline of like, okay, these are the inputs, these are the pressures, and this is what I'm going to do, because the reality is I'm finite, whatever management might wish.
Kind of revert on a sentiment I heard you say around having more time to focus on what matters. How does one begin to reconcile what matters in their life? Specifically, I'm thinking about someone like myself who grew up in a working class council estate whose reward systems encourage them that financial stability and prestige and status is what would make me happy, and trying to put the toothpaste back into the tube, I realised it doesn't. None of those things make me happy. How does one begin to self-examine themselves to understand what meaningful work or meaningful tasks look like?
I mean, I don't want to underestimate the importance of financial security and things like that, right? And to some extent, this is a sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs question. Like, you do need to focus on certain things in order to have the luxury to focus on the next ones. I think the big danger is to imagine that this kind of finding your life purpose, working out your guiding values is some kind of top-down thing where you're going to go away on a retreat for a week or whatever, and then come up with a system, and then you're going to like force your life to comply with this system. On some level, right, the list of things that make for a meaningful life is so universal that it's kind of boring, right? Where everyone knows that it's rich social relationships, that it time to yourself and time with others, time in nature, doing things that feel like they make a difference and serve other people, as well as simply sort of helping you make a living. This is like such a cliche. When it comes to actually like operationalizing that, I think it's really important to see it as a kind of a constant course correction, moment to moment thing. And for me, the real point at which the rubber hits the road with this question is not in some sort of mission statement of what you want your life to be, but in that feeling of like getting into that intuitive place of being able to choose, like, okay, I've got several things I could do with the next hour on Tuesday morning at 11 a.m. or whatever, or, you know, on a weekend. Which one? There are different ways into this. There's a great Jungian therapist called James Hollis who talks about asking which choice enlarges us or diminishes us. That's a really interesting question. Sometimes I think of it using phrases like, you know, what's the one thing that kind of needs to happen now? What's life asking of me right now? There's these various grand ways of doing it, but really, moment to moment, I think it's just doing what you can to keep in touch with that almost pre-verbal sense of like, is this something that is like a good way for me to be spending some of my time on the planet? It's kind of a dissatisfying answer, I accept, because it isn't a sort of a matrix and you get the answer at the end and then you go do it. But I think that's the way to do it. And I think it's then also a question of learning gradually and painfully to give like your full attention to that thing once you're doing it. I have situations all the time where I could choose to do more work, or I could choose to spend a bit more time with my 8-year-old son. And the cliche would be to say, like, the right thing to do is always to not do the work and always to spend time with the child. And, you know, I try to do that a lot, but the real important point is that, like, once I've decided that one of them is what I'm going to do, can I let go for that hour or two of all the thoughts about the other one that, like, sort of needs doing as well?
One of the concepts in your book that I really enjoyed was this idea of a life task. When we have greater endeavors, and we feel like we've got these greater endeavors in store for us, but we don't have the material or resources to achieve them. This concept of a life task is like, what's life calling of me at the moment, and what resources do I have surrounding me to achieve that? I really love that idea. Could you bring that to life for anyone who's listening?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of borrowed and probably adapted this idea from Carl Jung, right? The phrase is something that sort of Jungians like to use a lot. And some people talk about it as if like you have one life task in your life. I'm thinking of it more in a sort of moment to moment, week to week, month to month way. But it's this idea of like not asking, what do I want out of life right now? What would make me happy? But actually asking like, what's the work that like I'm here to do? Like, what's the thing that I am here to do? And I don't think that means that you have to, I think this is important. I don't think it means you have to give up your work or your ambitions as a singer-songwriter and become a humanitarian aid worker, or is that right? It could do, but it also could be that actually the thing that is yours to do is the thing that might feel to you like it's a hobby or like it's an indulgence or something. And I think it can sometimes take more strength of character to be okay with the fact that you're not going to be doing some sort of grandiose service to humankind as your thing. So it's not about like becoming just a pure kind of do-gooder instead of following what brings you alive. It's about following what brings you alive. But yeah, Jung makes this really interesting point that it's going to probably be difficult, right? Your life task is probably not going to be something that just comes completely easily and takes no effort and just involves like lying around doing nothing. But it's going to be something that you can do. Like there'll be a next step that you can take in your current situation. And what's so important about that, I think, is that there's a whole lot of ideas in the culture about destiny and fate and life purpose and all these things, where people get into their heads that like they were meant to be X, but their situation means they've got to be Y instead. And so, you know, the example I give in the book, like your life task is not going to be that you have to do something that involves spending thousands and thousands of pounds on film equipment to become a movie maker if you've got £100 in the bank. It might involve something that takes you there step by step later in the future, but it's not going to be like my economic situation means that I can't achieve my destiny. Or another example, maybe people sometimes feel that it was their sort of destiny and their purpose in life to have children, but they're not able to be biological parents. Again, your life task is something else, because your life task is adjacent to where you actually are. And even, I don't know, maybe there aren't life tasks in some sort of scientific sense, right? But that's just a really useful frame for thinking. Like, what is the intersection of what makes me feel alive and what I could do next with the resources that are around me right now, instead of like what lies over this kind of unreachable, unbridgeable chasm of opportunity or privilege or personality type or anything else.
That was a super useful concept when I was reading your book for me, because I was thinking about all the larger shows that exist, all the larger podcasts who have these LED backdrop walls and 8K cameras, and they did these amazing remote podcasts with 10, 15-man team. And at times I've been disheartened in my own journey around comparing myself to these other creators. But then I look back after hearing about the life task analogy. I've been looking back at the incremental kind of journey that I've been on, from like webcam podcasting to being here in the assembly rooms with like 4 guys behind the cameras and making most of what we have. And it allowed me to gain a level of peace and serenity that I never had before. And I think it's a really good analogy or frame for especially people from kind of lower socioeconomic backgrounds who don't have typical financial and non-financial resources to achieve what they might see on TV, on social media, is that there is a locus of control that lies within your environment to have a better life. And by better, I don't mean more fiscally secure, I just mean more enjoyable. And no matter where you are in your life, no matter what your origin story is, you have that locus of control. Everyone has a life task that lies before them, and they can take it.
Yeah, no, I really like the way you put that. And of course, I want to say as well that like there's a very common criticism of self-help culture in general, right? Which is that it's kind of relentlessly hyper-individual. And it says like, it's on you to sort out your life, and don't complain about having been born into a situation less privileged than somebody else. Just get to work.
Do you remember when Molly May went on, was it Stephen Bartlett's podcast that she went on and she got berated for saying we all have the same 24 hours? And it was like, when it went across the internet, she was absolutely torn apart for it.
Right, because like we do, but on the other hand, if you've got 10 people to do stuff for you in the 24 hours, it's different than if you haven't, right? I'm remembering a tweet that went everywhere in COVID as well, that was like some awful hustle culture stuff about like, if you don't come out of this pandemic with like a new business and like all this and this and this, then you never lacked time, you lacked discipline. Because it's like, what happened in COVID was we all suddenly had loads of time, especially those of us with preschool age children where they closed the preschools. No, but the thing I want to say is like these two ideas can exist simultaneously, right? Number one, we live in a society of a lot of economic inequality, and things should be changed to make that not the case. Number two, as an individual, wherever you find yourself in that, there is always this thing that you can do next. There's this somewhere in your circumference of possibility, there's that option for agency. And a lot of the sort of self-help stuff gets into this logjam where it's either socioeconomic circumstances don't matter, and it's all your responsibility, and if you're poor, it's your fault, and all that awful stuff. Or it's like,
the system's failed us.
System's failed us, and there's nothing you can do until there's a revolution, right? And like, I think we can reject both of those, or in some sense accept both of them, and say like, the challenge that I write about, I think, is the challenge of what do you do where you find yourself.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that where you find yourself is like, that it's right that you find yourself there.
I'm going to try and pull it out from your book, actually. There's a line towards the beginning around saying life is like a scrapyard and your job is to play with the ruins. Something along...
Yeah, Sasha Chapin. This is a writer who he's got, like, he talks about how like he had this sort of great ambition to be a certain kind of novelist, and that was his like big life ambition. And then it was only sort of after that had crashed and he'd realized that was never going to be on the cards for him, that he was able to sort of adopt this stance of what he calls playing in the ruins, right? It's like, finally, I don't need to make my reality measure up to some idea in my head or that I got from my parents or the culture. I can just like see what I have and what would be the coolest stuff that I can do with it right here.
I love it. I absolutely love it. One of the things that unearthed my own attitude towards productivity was almost renouncing planning, or at least my attachment with planning. And there's another great quote in your book. I think it's Marcus Aurelius, and I'm going to absolutely bastardize this right now. But
New translation.
it's a Scottish translation. Let me actually find it. I think it's Chanters. And just like that, I opened it up. Never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present. I absolutely love that. Because every single week I'll find myself derailing from a habit or a promise I've made to myself, and on a Sunday evening I go into ChatGPT or some other AI tool and say, make me a plan this week so I don't miss this habit. But and if I do miss these habits, I actually berate myself. I remember James Clear having a quote in Atomic Habits, and it's something like, every action is a vote for the type of person you become, or something like that. Yeah, something like that. And every time I miss one of those habits, then I'm like lambasting my own character for that. But in your book, you kind of dissect the individualistic relationship with planning.
I mean, to me, that Marcus Aurelius quote is so lovely because it sort of points out this really strange thing that we do, right? Which is we just don't trust future us to stay on the straight and narrow or to do the thing that the moment calls for when it arrives. But we really trust present self to make these kind of incredibly rigid plans, which we're then going to like try and hold ourselves to. Problem with this is like either it fails because life gets in the way and interrupts you and your plan it's impossible to stick to and you berate yourself. Or even when it succeeds, it sort of has this effect for me anyway, and I know I'm not alone, I don't know if it's universal, but like it sort of drains life of its life and vigor somehow, right? Because your week just becomes like, oh, I'm just putting into practice these steps that like this guy, which was me yesterday, decided that I had to put into practice, or ChatGPT decided, even worse, I would say. So like, I think a lot of the time what we're doing when we try to plan in this very ambitious way is we're trying to kind of throw a straitjacket around the future and say like, this is what is going to happen. And I can be confident now that this is what I'm going to want to do later, or I'm going to make myself do later, or that events are going to allow me to do later. And Marcus in that quote is just saying like, well, first of all, I would say, he almost certainly says it as well somewhere because he says all the wisdom, but like, firstly, you can't know in advance the situation when you tell yourself that you're going to go and do X habit at X o'clock. Like, not only do you not know what will happen in your external reality, but your mood is like it's a factor, right? You can't just completely ignore the fact that you might feel absolutely unable or unmotivated to do it. But on the other hand, like, you've got a really good track record up till now in your life of having managed to like do a bunch of stuff and respond to things when they happen and sort of go with the flow and take things as they arise. I think what this speaks to is a role for planning, which is not like throw it out and just sort of float around doing nothing, but to really understand it as a kind of a navigational tool. So I'm a big fan of like, writing out in sort of present tense language, the sort of that kind of ideal normal day practice that people have got, right? That sort of idea of like having a vision of how you'd like to be showing up in your life and how you'd like your life to be. Or having some sort of basic principles that you're navigating by. The problem comes when you take them and you like turn it into this incredibly rigid, like these are my monthly targets, these are my weekly milestones, these are my daily things, and then this is the time box day of everything that's going to happen. Apart from anything else, you're saying like it doesn't matter what you feel like in the moment. And I would say like maybe we could harness that energy of what we feel like instead of constantly trying to stamp it out. I've certainly found life goes more smoothly and successfully that way, right? Because it does matter what you feel like doing. Doesn't mean you just hedonistically amble through life doing nothing difficult. But it does matter what you feel like.
Yeah, double click on that for me. Like, what role does our desires play in navigating us through life?
I mean, I can't. I think I mentioned it in the book, but I certainly mentioned it. I'm losing track. But like this, there's a blog post that a friend of mine, the meditation teacher Susan Piver, wrote, which has the headline "Getting Things Done by Not Being Mean to Yourself," which was a real sort of moment of insight for me, because I realized exactly how mean I had been being to myself to try to get things done. There is this inner conflict that we set up when we say, like, these are things I'm going to do, and I'm not going to let my stupid moods get in the way. And even that quote that everyone loves from Chuck Close, right? Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up and get to work. Like, everyone loves that. It's like so down to earth and like just, getting down to business. But it has this edge of like, it doesn't matter what mood you're in. It doesn't matter what gives you pleasure in life. It's just do it, do it, do it, do it. And apart from anything else, it's just not a constructive way to get those things done, because you set up this inner struggle. You're so annoyed with yourself. It's just sort of internal combat. And Susan Piver writes about how when she allowed herself to do the things that she wanted to do, when she allowed that question, like, what do I feel like doing, to at least have some role in navigating through the day, a lot of those things you might worry you would never get around to doing, she did. Because like most of us, the implication of a lot of people seem to assume that they'd be like the worst people in the world if they didn't keep a hawkish eye on themselves, right, all day long. They just completely forget it all and unravel. But that's not true. Like, if you're interested in this stuff in the first place, you're interested in doing interesting stuff in the world and keeping your commitments and delivering things you said you'll deliver and shipping product and all the rest of it. So there's something really important about allowing a role for what you feel like doing and harnessing that energy, instead of snapping it in.
If I were to swap myself out and David Goggins were to be sitting here,
oh yeah,
what do you think he would say
he'd be
to
running.
you?
He'd be running for 100 miles down the street instead. I mean, what he would say, interesting. I'd like to do a podcast with him. I guess I don't know his work in enough detail to understand whether my general sense from some of the shorter clips that I've seen here and there of him not being a happy person, I don't know if that's fair, right? I'm not inside his mind, and it's totally unfair of me to say that. I think that self-discipline is really important and often plays a role. A certain kind of combative self-discipline often plays a role for people in getting them out of a kind of a rut or a bad situation. And then it sort of risks becoming the only method that they know. The idea that there's always got to be more, there's always got to be, harder, faster, more endurance, more success. So yeah, you asked me what he would say. He would probably say that this was a recipe for just sort of unraveling into a person who ended life frustrated that they hadn't achieved their dreams. But I don't think that it is. I think I would argue with that if imaginary David Goggins in my head made that argument. Do you think he'd say that? I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's making me think about those, and I've been guilty of it, who attach or interchange the outcome to the measure. Mm-hmm. And I'm reminded of, is it Jerry Seinfeld in your book, who kind of satirically talks about doing things every single day, and every single day when he writes a joke or performs a joke, he writes an X in his calendar to showcase that he does it every single day. And in fact, it was satire, it was a joke. And in fact, we should be doing things daily-ish. But then there's so many of us who attach ourselves to almost like the internal tally mark.
Yeah, I mean, that was such an interesting case, because I'm not even sure it was satire exactly. I think he was just generally saying, like, if you want to get good at something, you have to do it many days. But then I got to interview him for The Guardian, and what the interview was not about...
Which is crazy, like Jerry Seinfeld, that's nuts.
No, it was amazing. Fun. And the interview was not about productivity, by the way, but I snuck in my questions, right? Because I wanted to be like, do you really do this every day? And turned out he'd some like up and coming or wannabe comic had asked him this question, like how to get the work done at some club once, and he'd said this thing, but he was just completely incredulous that anyone thought this was useful information. He's like, yeah, if you want to get good at something, you have to like do it. You know, if you just never do it, it's not going to happen. And that's a sort of it's a kind of athletic approach to creativity, which I think is really interesting, right? Nobody would ever think that no tennis player would think that they were going to stay good at tennis by just sort of, putting in a really intense day every couple of months. And he was saying the same thing. But yes, that notion that what he was really meaning was like, you must never break the chain and you must keep that streak going. It's quite harmful, actually, because then, when you do break the chain, it becomes a much bigger deal than if you are just trying to do things daily-ish. Because, like you're such a loser because now there's a single gap in the chain. I think the much more important skill is actually like being able to get back in the saddle and say like, okay, I did this for 3 days and then I missed a couple of days, but that's okay. Now I'll do the next day. It's too brittle otherwise, right? To say like, I'm never going to break the chain, because you will for some reason. And then you'll end up sort of more demotivated than if you hadn't been trying to keep the streak going.
And I guess if you can unclench that idea of having to do something every single day and tie that to your self-worth, the thing that might actually fill that gap when you do break it could be something more richer, more story-worthy than the habit itself. Because I remember it was 2 weeks ago, I was sat in a university library just doing some podcast work, because I tend to do that most days or every day. And I booked a random trip to Morocco within like 24 hours of the flight. And for so long, I was kind of thinking about the opportunity cost of doing that. I was berating myself for not having worked out enough that week and not doing enough podcast stuff that week. And then went on this amazing 3-4 night escapade to like a rural surf town in Morocco, and had the most incredible time, amazing stories. But just kind of ironically, what I ended up doing while I was there was filming a podcast.
Right.
So what seemed to be a gap in my routine actually filled it with something that was far more rich than staying in Glasgow on a miserable day.
Yeah, well, I mean, and this is the sort of big, deep point that this connects to, right? Is one of the many ways in which we're limited as humans is that we don't have like anything close to unlimited knowledge of like what would be the most meaningful thing to do with a bit of time in the future or in the present. So like, this is another argument against overly rigid planning, because the sort of really rigid planner is assuming that he or she is like knows everything about what could happen and be most useful, and actually like we have some role in that, but no, you can't possibly say, even if you'd gone there and just had a good time, that could have in some more sort of intangible way played very positively into future projects, or could have just been a good way to use 3 or 4 of your days on the planet. And as it was even better than that. But yeah.
When I met Jimmy Carr for an interview maybe like a year ago, he brought up atelic tasks, and it's something I think he brought from one of your books.
Oh, right.
And I believe it's the type of task that you do for the task's sake, not for what it gets you, essentially. And it's quite funny, actually. I was speaking to my girlfriend recently, who's a PhD candidate, and she was working by herself all the time, feeling very dissatisfied because she didn't have a community around her to support her and to bounce ideas off of, and to go through what is such an arduous adventure by herself. So she started this writing group. So she had camaraderie and shared experience and a shared reality. And of course, the first thing I mentioned to her was like, "Oh, you can monetize this. There could be a paywall here."
Right.
And she was like, "Dude, I'm not gonna like." It's such a you thing to like to take something that is so wholesome and then attach a pay tag to it.
Right. Do it for some other reason.
And then she reminded me of this term, like a telic, like just doing it for the sake of doing. And it was just a funny.
No, that's a great example. Yeah, I write about that term. It comes originally from, or as far as I know, it comes originally from a philosopher called Kiran Setia, who talks about how easy it is to slip into that and how he realized at midlife he had slipped into that mindset where like the value of everything you're doing is because it's leading up to something else. And like this has a role in life, right? It's good to pursue long-term projects and build businesses and create organizations and make money and build families, all et cetera, et cetera. But like at some point, there has to be something in your life that you're doing like for itself. Otherwise, you get into that trap of like the meaning of life is always in the future, and then one day you die, and that's and you never got there. So yeah, I've found. I mean, getting a bit older will do this as well, right? You start to sort of. I think it's a sort of a natural development for lots of people. You start to think, well, like, okay, do I want to be doing that with that day when I'm asked to do some particular opportunity comes along, right? That's got to have a role to play along with, will it be for my benefit or somebody's benefit in the long run?
Does over-resting in goals strip meaning from the present?
Over-investing in goals. Yeah, I mean, I think that is what we're talking about here, right? It's this sense that if the ultimate real reason that you're doing anything is to get to that place where you can say like, I've achieved this thing, then you do sort of empty out the present of its of its value. And yeah, as I say, like it's not that I don't particularly advocate. Still less do I live a kind of a goal-free life where there's nothing I'm working on, nothing I want to achieve, and nothing that I'd like to change about my situation or anything like that. But you've got to take some time to connect to that question of like, do I often enough find what I'm doing to be absorbing and fun in the moment? Like, not all the time, not everything, but like, does that have a role in life? Otherwise, yeah, you end up sort of totally focused on that moment. And as we all know, like when you do achieve some sort of long sought after goal, very often you feel really thrilled about it for about an hour, or a day, and then all you do is erect the next big goal in your mind that you've got to be reaching.
Hearing you speak about interviewing Jerry Seinfeld, I want to ask, are there any other notable characters that you've interviewed surrounding productivity and daily routines and goal setting? And my follow-on question is, are there any surprising insights from different industries that either surprised you or shocked you?
It's a really interesting question. Like I did a whole chunk of my career where I got to interview some like big name people, but it wasn't the chunk of my career that was writing about productivity. I was really interested, but I was often in this situation where I'd be interviewing like, a famous actor or politician or somebody.
Can you name drop any?
I mean, who are the biggest name people I ever interviewed? I interviewed Bill Clinton.
What was Bill Clinton like, Oliver?
I mean, it's a cliche about Bill Clinton, right? That he makes anyone he's talking to feel like the most important person in the room at the time, and that was the secret of his success. And so, I definitely got that sense. Like, I definitely thought every question I was asking him seemed to be like a brilliant question, but I don't think they were. I think he's just good at making you feel like they were. And we had like 20 minutes or something. Because the schedule was ridiculous, and you should be grateful for a 20-minute interview with Bill Clinton. And so, but I think when the 20 minutes came up and his aide came and like whispered in his ear that time was up, he made some sort of indication that like he was sufficiently interested in our conversation that he wanted to keep going longer. In hindsight, I bet that was all just planned, right? He had half an hour, and the guy comes at 10 minutes to the end, and then the journalist thinks you're amazing and you get wonderful press. I don't know, but anyway, all I was going to say was, when interviewing people like this, but also kind of people in the creative industries as well, I have always been like slightly obsessive about asking about their daily routines and rituals, because that does really fascinate me about all those people. And of course, even at levels far below Bill Clinton, people have like huge teams handling things for them, so it's different. But also, like, one thing that fascinates me about politics is no matter how high up you get as in politics, like the day-to-day events that are coming your way are deeply unpredictable. I find that really fascinating. Like, you know, you can achieve the power of being a prime minister or president, and like you've got no real idea what you're going to have to be focused on the next day. And then creative people, it's different as well, right? Because you can be like a big time movie star or a big time writer director person, but the bit of your creativity that's going to make you good at your job is like it's outside of your control, and you might like you have to sort of be very willing to go with the flow and roll with the punches. So in both these cases, these people, the kind of people I interviewed a lot, they had a lot of power and authority and a lot of help and all the rest of it, but like even that didn't give them control over time, really, which I think is really interesting. Like there's something very interesting and deep there to think about.
What impact do you think artificial intelligence will have on how people plan and organize their life? And do you think it's a force for good in that aspect or not?
I'm definitely going through a curmudgeonly phase with AI, right? I'm definitely sort of, you know, when I mention it in my writing or on social platforms, or I'm definitely more likely to be grumbling and moaning than excitedly welcoming it. I think it's a very complicated picture, right? Because I tend to be thinking most about like generative AI and its role in writing, not the role of AI in, you know, really important work that could lead to a cure for cancer or, you know, other kinds, or sort of, you know, pure science and stuff. There's all sorts of stuff where, of course, it's really important. I tend to think in that role as like as a personal helper, whether that's productivity and planning or kind of the therapeutic uses that are so controversially like very prominent at the moment. I think there's mainly pitfalls, to be honest, more than there are advantages at the moment. Really, because our problem always with technology, I think, is to mistake a tool for something more than a tool or different than a tool. And everything about LLMs certainly like invites you to make that mistake, right? It's like, there's nothing wrong with using apps to plan your week, and there's nothing wrong with using an app that sits on a large language model to plan your week. But if you actually think that like there's a brain there that is thinking and that is valuing and that has the capacity to sort of value certain things in a genuine, real way, I think that's false about what's going on inside the code of an LLM, right? There isn't somebody there. And if you're using it as a therapist, I think even more so, right? There's the sort of the idea that it will reflect back to you what you put into it and what you ask it is not just a factor of like, you know, sycophancy in the current models. I think it's like deeply structured into the idea of what's going on there, right? That there isn't another individual human. There is, if anything, just like an aggregation and an averaging of human wisdom and knowledge from everything it's been trained on, which can be useful, but it's not a connection between two people. And I think that's really important. Like, I think that if this conversation that I'm greatly enjoying, if it was to be suddenly revealed to me that I was talking to an extremely, like a lifelike robot who could simulate everything, like
I'm not far from Oliver.
even if it simulated it perfectly, once I knew that, something would have been very important would have been lost, because it's the fact that that I assume you are a conscious, feeling, aware person looking out from behind your eyes, like me, that makes for the possibility of something meaningful here.
I interviewed a gentleman called Chris Ramanini, who's the founder of an AI assistant unicorn called Fireflies. I'm not sure if you've ever joined a call where someone has one of these in the background.
Yeah, I'm aware of Fireflies, yeah.
And he was telling me about kind of the worrying nature of AI companionship and how he's seen it. I'm not sure if it happened in the US or in the UK, that one of these large language models organizations removed their AI companionship feature, or the ability to have companionship with the AI, and there was large-scale protests out on the street, and it's just so worrying that these people have conflated what is amalgamation of their input with being a person behind the screens. And I remember when in the past when I've used AI to plan my day and things without ever putting any sort of personal identifiable information into it, or lo and behold, what I think is PII information into it, or any sort of biographical information into it, it responds to me in with Scottish slang. And I find that deeply disturbing.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so to kind
That's
of eliminate what you
interesting.
were saying, that it does have this mirage that it is your friend, it is a trusted individual,
Yeah.
that it is perhaps a therapeutic figure in your life, and in some cases, people are using it as a
Yeah.
companion,
Yeah.
and it's terrifying.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And like, God knows what combination, I don't know if you have like it's memory enabled or what combination of like algorithmic clues it's drawing on to do that. But like, yeah, that's quite weird, the Scottish slang part. Yeah, no, and I think I think we're all prone to do that a little bit. You see and you read about these high profile examples of psychosis where people kind of completely lose track of reality because they're convinced they're God, because the AI reinforces that. South Park has been very brilliant on this topic, if you've seen any of those episodes recently. But we're all a little bit prone to that. I mean, I've been a bit worried about this ever since, like, Alexa and Siri, right? They encourage us to think that there's somebody there, and some sort of, not literally, we all know that there's nobody there when you talk to Alexa. But in the sort of felt sense, you're sort of just like chatting or making requests of this person. And there's, like, you can see it in little kids, right? Like, there's something wrong about a device where you're encouraged to think of it as a person, but you're also encouraged to think of it as just carrying out your every whim. Because that's kind of like a bad relationship to have. And so kids become very rude around, like, this was always a worry since Alexa first came on the scene, that it would turn kids into like assholes, basically, because they would obnoxiously demand things of Alexa, and then they would just obnoxiously demand things of their parents as well, because like they didn't know any better. So I think there's something really important about what it does to us as humans. Yeah.
What's come to mind, Oliver, is some of your writing around burnout, actually. One of the fascinating insights that I've received from your book, and I might be kind of going off piste or bastardizing this a little bit, is that burnout doesn't always stem from metaphorically putting your foot down on the accelerator to like the red zone in a kind of pressure gauge or an acceleration gauge, but in fact can come from routine-like, mechanistic, sedentary type tasks. You can actually have very similar symptoms to burnout from doing kind of low effort menial tasks. And I think about AI, how AI can replace some of these tasks, whether it's diary management or sending and receiving emails. Yeah, I'm just curious to know your thoughts on burnout.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I don't know. I sort of agree with what you said, but I'm not sure I wrote it in exactly those terms. But I think it's like burnout has a meaning component, right? So it's not like we all know, and hopefully have experienced times in our own work where like you are like operating at the absolute extremes of your capacities, but because it is something that like totally lights your fire, it's not going to lead to burnout, because it's what you want to be doing. And you can, yeah, I think like burnout is something that has this component of like, why am I doing this? What, like, this is making my soul shrivel rather than expand, and I think AI, the problem is like, okay, so AI can take some of those tasks that we don't want to do off our plates, just as some people are in a position to have other humans take those tasks off their plates. But if I'm right about things like the efficiency trap, like this is not going to make you feel like your time is more abundant. It's going to make you experience more pressure to do more of those things that only you can do. Now, maybe some people claim we're not very far away from there being nothing that only you can do. But as long as there is stuff like, so the logic in your situation, I'm guessing, I don't have a podcast, but my logic in your situation, I'm guessing, is that like the more post-production stuff that you can just sort of farm out to automation, and so it's like conversations with people that are the thing that you can do, like really, really specifically. the general market of podcasts will lead to you feeling incredibly pressured to put out far more of them, or far longer ones, or far deeper ones. So that whatever it is that you still do, in the same way that when you get better at sending emails, you receive more emails. When you get better at doing the human part of your work, because other devices are doing the things that they can do, there'll just be more and more felt pressure to like do more and more of that stuff, to a point where I suspect it leads to the same kind of burnout, right? Because the pressure is still there. The shorter way of saying the very long-winded thing I just said is, I don't see anything about the ways in which AI can make our lives and our days more efficient that makes it immune from that basic problem, that like the pursuit of efficiency, all else being equal, leads to greater overwhelm and busyness rather than a sense of abundant time.
What are your thoughts on side hustles and hobbies?
So, I mean, the place where I've written something explicitly about this, mainly in 4,000 Weeks, is this idea that like, this is atelic activities again, right? A hobby is something you do because it's fun to do it. You might have certain goals, like, collect all the stamps from a certain country or whatever, right? But you're basically doing it because it makes you feel good, feels meaningful to do it. And then the side hustle obviously is very explicitly framed as something you're trying to make money from. I'm not against that in some sort of intrinsic way. Like, you should, if you've got a job, you shouldn't also do something else that is exciting and interesting and could make you rich one day. That's brilliant. But I think we should be aware of what it is we lose when we think about turning hobbies into side hustles, right? When you think about trying to turn the thing that you enjoy doing outside of work into something that pays. Because, like, a little bit of the example you gave your partner in the PhD writing group and charging, right, all that stuff. Obviously, if you're trying to get a PhD, that is also a professional goal, not a hobby. But it's another example of the way in which, like, making something instrumental, like taking from like, this is what we're doing, to let's do this so that we can do this other thing, has this problem of sort of removing the value and the fulfillingness from it. And I think it's really interesting, as I wrote, right, that like, hobbies are kind of cringe. I mean, I think this is changing actually since I wrote it, but like, hobbies are still kind of a bit like embarrassing, and side hustles are very like cool and suggest that you've got lots of ambition and vigor and energy. And I think that's interesting, because there is something kind of countercultural and subversive about like, just like doing some craft activity because you really like doing that craft activity and you don't expect anyone ever to pay you money for it. And I wonder whether that's why they've acquired this reputation as being a bit sort of like, what do you even do with your life if you're spending hours a week on a hobby that isn't even part of a business plan? But I think lots of the people who are doing it, what they're doing is having really fulfilling lives.
I think I heard you on a show, and correct me if I'm not wrong, talking about how Sir Rod Stewart has a fascination with like model trains.
He's got a model train set. Yeah, he's got a huge model train layout. And he's given interviews a few times to like Railway Modeler magazine, right? And they just get this amazing exclusives because it's all about model railways. Yeah, he's got an extensive, what would you call it? I don't know. Yeah, an extensive layout based on sort of historical Chicago and New York, I think. And apparently he took it on tour with him when he was more regularly touring than he is now. And like, he'd book another hotel room for the layout. Which, given the stories about what rock stars get up to on tour, and probably even Rod Stewart, it's not that.
Maybe he was doing both at the same time.
Right. I mean, it's not exactly. It's not that edgy, is it? But I think what I so love about that story, right, is that like, it's so not on message for the sort of personal brand of Rod Stewart that you've got to believe he really loves it. Like, you've got to believe that is in the whole of the other aspects of his personality, good or bad, whatever, like, there is something there that is just like super into model railways, because you would not do that to to burnish your image as a kind of leather-trousered, raunchy rocker, right? It doesn't work. It doesn't fit. It's the wrong thing. And slightly meanly in 4,000 Weeks, I sort of compared that with like Richard Branson kite surfing. I'm sure Richard Branson really enjoys kite surfing, but it is on message with his brand, right? It does go together. Those photos of him doing that kind of stuff sort of are good publicity photos for his enterprises. And so I think it's really interesting when you find that somebody is doing something that just isn't on message. It's like, oh, right. That might be an activity that just like really nourishes their soul.
When I heard that on the podcast that you were on, I can't remember what show it was on, when I heard that, the first thing I thought was, that's cute.
Right, it's like, sort of adorable,
yeah,
right?
Why are hobbies cute?
Right, exactly, exactly. And I wrote too about like how I've got like, sometimes it can really help for these hobbies to be things you're not even that good at, right? Because then there's no temptation of turning it into something more. I actually think that Rod Stewart has said in these interviews that he's not particularly like skilled at painting. That he gets, I think he even hires other people to do bits of the layout, right? But it's like, that's another sign of something that is sort of important like that. Playing the piano is like that for me. I really enjoy what I do, hammering out like dodgy old piano rock tunes on the keyboard that we've got at home, preferably with headphones on so that other people aren't inconvenienced. But I am rubbish at it. And actually, although there's nothing wrong with having a hobby of wanting to be really good at a musical instrument, of course, there's something kind of good for me about this because like when it comes to writing, I really hope that I'm good at it. I want to stay good at it and get better at it. I want to be commercially successful at it. Like it's quite a lot of pressure. No pressure at all when it comes to playing the piano because nobody is ever going to pay me £1 to play the piano, I know. And that
may pay you £1 to stop.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So that is why it's a sort of like, it has a role in my life that is important for me because it's not, because I'm not going to be good at it.
I really like that message, specifically, not to attribute this to gender, but like men. Like, I think all of my mates who I hang around with would never admit that they have a hobby. They would always call it a side hustle.
Right, yeah.
Because there's something gritty and noble and
there's
prestigious about it.
Stereotypically, there's definitely a masculine emphasis on like instrumental goals and traditionally the people who like spend time crafting are women. So I think there is something real in that observation, and that it's we could do with becoming more, getting in touch with both the masculine and the feminine in that sense. Yeah.
I'm gonna go home to bake a banana bread now after this. I'm thinking about if there were to be like a central, I guess, life task in Meditations for Mortals, like a single ask of the reader to take away, or a next step for them to take away. What do you think that would be if there was one?
I mean, this is where I risk sounding sales pitchy and say like it's to read the book, but kind of it is, because what I wanted to try to do in structuring this around 28 days of very short daily chapters was to, as I said at the beginning, right, like try to create a book that could be an active ingredient in that process rather than just something that like gave you some knowledge and then you maybe decided to. So one thing, it's not the only thing you can do at all, and I will say something else, but like the what I put into this book was an attempt to be like, you could actually kind of do this book. Like reading if it works, reading at least some of these chapters is going to like have a little perspective change that just naturally leads to a slight difference in how you go through that next 24 hours. A little bit more aware of what it means to be limited and to be facing choices with time and to be prone to wanting to control your life more than you usefully can and all the rest of it. Not necessarily a big lightning strike, insight transformation, right? But just that bit where it just gets under your skin and makes a difference. Besides that, I think like the kind of question, I'm not saying you asked this, but I've been asked questions in the past where I know that what somebody's wanting is like, here's the daily practice that you should do, right? Here's the 10 minutes a day thing that if you do this every day, you'll be well on the way to success. And I always resist that. Like I always want to say, the one thing you should do is you should think for a moment, take a breath, think about something that you know you want to have in your life, in a meaningful life, something that you've been putting off, some project you want to get started on, some relationship or friendship you want to get better at nurturing, some place you like to be in your town, city, you know, something that you already know is a component of the meaningful life. Not like the most important thing, because that's optimization stuff again, right? But just like something. And like do something related to that thing. Like, no, but actually do it, like now. Like when you finish watching this or listening to this, go and do it. Or if it's late at night, do it tomorrow. But like not, oh yes, that's a very good idea, I'll make it part of my life plan. It's the actually doing it. Can you send a message to a friend that who you've been meaning to be in touch with, even though you're kind of tired and it feels like it wouldn't be the best message ever? Can you make the call that is relevant to the business project you want to move forward, even though you've been thinking like, oh, I'm going to wait till I've really got my ducks in a row and know what it is? Just something like that, right? One thing, not one thing you're going to do every single day for the rest of your life, not one thing you're going to do perfectly, but just one thing, and like actually do it. That's the thing that's made the biggest difference to me. So that's what I pass on to other people.
Oliver Burkeman, everyone.